North Africa, 1942. The desert was silent except for the crackle of cooling metal. A captured U.S. Army Jeep sat half buried in the sand, its paint scorched, its engine still ticking in the heat. Around it, a small group of Wehrmacht mechanics circled like archaeologists studying a strange artifact. They had fought the Americans for barely a few weeks. Already they had seen their trucks, their tanks, their endless supplies, but nothing puzzled them quite like this little machine. One of the Germans knelt and ran a hand across the bodywork. The Jeep looked fragile, almost crude. Flat panels, simple bolts, no armor, no luxury. But when they opened the hood, their expressions changed. Everything inside was precise, accessible, efficient. The parts fit like clockwork, not the product of a craftsman, but of an assembly line. "It's nothing special," one said quietly, tightening a wrench. Then he paused, eyes narrowing as the simplicity revealed its brilliance. Nothing special, yet they built thousands of them. In that moment, the German army, heirs to centuries of engineering pride, glimpsed the true weapon of the United States. It wasn't the Jeep itself, it was the system that made it. By 1942, the deserts of North Africa had become a proving ground for machines as much as men. Engines burned, tires shredded, and metal buckled under a sun that showed no mercy. The armies fighting there, British, Italian, German, and now American, learned quickly that victory in the desert depended less on strategy than on logistics. Whoever could move fastest, fix fastest, and resupply fastest would win. When the Americans landed in North Africa under Operation Torch in November 1942, they brought something new to that unforgiving landscape: a squat, boxy, open-top vehicle that looked almost like a toy. To the Germans who first saw it bouncing across the dunes, it was an oddity. But within weeks, the Willys Jeep became one of the most respected and feared machines of the war. The Jeep was born not from luxury or tradition, but from necessity. In 1940, with war looming, the U.S. Army had issued an urgent request to American manufacturers: design a light, four-wheel drive reconnaissance car, fast, strong, and simple to repair. Of the 135 companies invited, only 3 responded: Bantam, Willys Overland, and Ford. Within weeks, they produced prototypes. Within months, America had standardized a design that could be built by any factory, anywhere. That design became the Willys MB, later joined by the nearly identical Ford GPW. Together, they would roll off production lines in astonishing numbers, over 640,000 units by the war's end. No 2 Jeeps were identical in finish, yet every bolt, every part, every curve could fit another Jeep perfectly. They were built for war, not for pride. For the Germans, whose engineering tradition prized precision and craftsmanship, this was almost heretical. They built machines to perfection. The Americans built them to work, and to keep working. At the same time, the German Army's equivalent light vehicle was the Volkswagen Kübelwagen, designed by Ferdinand Porsche and produced by the same company that would later become a symbol of post-war prosperity. The Kübelwagen was efficient, reliable, and cleverly engineered, but it was also delicate, requiring meticulous care. It could handle mud and dirt, but not the chaos of war's extremes. Its air-cooled engine was a marvel of design, but repairs required skill and tools. Every component reflected Germany's obsession with mechanical perfection, and its curse. The Jeep, by contrast, looked crude beside it. Its windshield folded down. Its body was flat steel. Its engine, the humble Go Devil 4-cylinder, could be dismantled in the field with a wrench and a few minutes of patience. It didn't glide. It climbed, splashed, and roared through every obstacle. As one German officer later admitted, "Our vehicles were designed by engineers. The Jeep was designed by soldiers." That difference between artistry and functionality mirrored the deeper divide between the two nations' war machines when the Africa Corps began. Capturing American equipment in late 1942, the first intact Jeeps caused immediate fascination. German field mechanics trained on precision vehicles like the Panzer III and the Opel Blitz gathered around them as if studying an alien machine. They were astonished by what they found: not complexity, but deliberate simplicity. Every part seemed built for replacement. The axles, the clutch, the carburetor, all accessible in seconds. Even the tools needed were standard across the vehicle. It was, in their words, a car any soldier could understand. One report sent back to Berlin described it bluntly. The American Jeep represents a different philosophy. Practical, expendable, and made for mass. Those words would haunt German engineers, trapped in a system that prized innovation over scale. For every Jeep the Americans built, Germany could only produce a handful of Kübelwagens, and with far greater effort. In the harsh clarity of the North African desert, the truth was unmistakable. The side that could replace its machines faster would outlast the other. German logistics, stretched thin across the Mediterranean, could barely keep up with the demands of Rommel's forces. Spare parts were scarce, repairs slow, and replacements months away. Meanwhile, American convoys unloaded Jeeps by the hundreds, each ready to drive off the ship and straight into battle. The Jeep became more than transport. It was mobility itself. It could serve as a scout car, ambulance, command post, or machine gun carrier. Soldiers nicknamed it the Blitz Buggy, a machine that carried generals and privates alike across terrain where tanks bogged down. When German mechanics captured one intact near El Guetar, they didn't just see an enemy vehicle, they saw a revelation, a rolling symbol of industrial democracy, where every part was replaceable, every worker mattered, and every factory could build victory. In that simplicity lay America's greatest secret: mass production, unbreakable reliability, and the power of a nation that built for endurance, not elegance. As the war expanded across continents, the Jeep followed, from the dunes of Libya to the snow of the Ardennes, from island jungles in the Pacific to the shattered roads of France. Wherever American troops went, the Jeep went with them. And behind every captured Jeep, German engineers saw not just a vehicle but a riddle. How could something so ordinary perform so well? To the German mind, craftsmanship had always been sacred. Their tanks, aircraft, and even trucks reflected the same philosophy. That performance and precision justified complexity. Engines were works of art. Components were hand-fitted, refined, perfected. But perfection took time, and time was something Germany no longer had. By 1943, German industry was strained to its limit. Allied bombing campaigns targeted railways, factories, and oil depots. Skilled workers were drafted into the army. Raw materials became scarce. Every new vehicle demanded careful manufacture and inspection. In contrast, American production had reached a scale the world had never seen. Factories in Toledo, Michigan, and Dearborn, Michigan, worked around the clock. Women replaced men on assembly lines. Steel, rubber, and glass flowed in endless quantities. The Jeep was built in such numbers that generals joked it was as common as a rifle. One rolled off an American production line every 2 minutes. This was the difference between two philosophies, between precision and production, between a nation that crafted for excellence and one that built for endurance, and in the long run, endurance would win. Captured Jeeps continued to arrive at German workshops in Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy. Each one deepened the same impression. America's genius wasn't invention, it was standardization. Everything was interchangeable. The same bolt could fit a Jeep, a truck, or a generator. Every tool was universal. Every design was modular. This was industrial warfare. The idea that complexity was weakness. German field mechanics, accustomed to hand-fitting components and machining replacements from scratch, suddenly found themselves admiring this brutal efficiency. They disassembled engines, measured tolerances, and compared them to their own Kübelwagens. The conclusion was always the same. It is not elegant, but it is perfect for war. Even Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, took note of the American Jeep. Reports from his logistics officers reached his headquarters regularly. They described its speed, its adaptability, its uncanny ability to cross ground that even German half-tracks avoided. Rommel, an officer who valued movement above all else, understood what it meant. Mobility, not armor, would decide the desert war. He remarked to one of his aides, "If I had an army of those, I could drive to Cairo in a week." But he never would. Germany's production system was too rigid, its economy too specialized, and its engineers too proud to imitate the crude brilliance of American design. The Jeep was a symbol of what Germany could not become: flexible, scalable, and built for mass production. Behind the Jeep's simple frame lay something greater, the social and industrial ecosystem of the United States. It was the product of a culture that prized practicality, teamwork, and problem-solving. Factory workers in Ohio, Kansas, and California didn't build for a Führer or a flag. They built for the boys overseas, brothers, sons, neighbors. That sense of shared purpose gave every Jeep a human weight. By 1944, the vehicle had become a cultural icon. Soldiers carved names into its hoods, painted nose art, and trusted it like an old friend. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. A machine that always started even when morale didn't. The Germans, who prized machines almost as living works of genius, were fascinated by this new relationship between man and machine, one built not on admiration, but on utility. By the time the Afrika Korps surrendered in May 1943, thousands of German soldiers had encountered the Jeep, some as enemies, others as prisoners driving captured models for Allied officers. Those experiences left an impression that outlasted the war itself. Many German POWs later recalled how the Jeep represented everything America stood for: speed, simplicity, and limitless production. One mechanic captured near Bizerte told his interrogators, "We spent years building cars that were too perfect to replace. You built cars you could lose and still win." That single sentence captured the entire industrial philosophy of World War II. For Germany, every vehicle was a masterpiece. For America, every vehicle was a tool, and tools can be made again. It was not superiority of design that won the war. It was superiority of scale. The captured Jeep in North Africa was more than a machine. It was a mirror, reflecting the future of warfare and the inevitable decline of an empire that valued perfection over practicality. And for those German mechanics staring into its open engine bay, the revelation was simple. America didn't just build better machines, it built a better way of making them. By the time the war entered its middle years, the Jeep was no longer just a vehicle. It was a lens through which both friend and foe could see the United States itself. To the Germans who examined it, every bolt, hinge, and weld spoke of something deeper, a civilization that had learned to turn simplicity into power. In the technical reports written by captured German engineers, the Jeep was described not as advanced, but as ingeniously basic. There was nothing extraordinary about its engine, a 4-cylinder, 60-horsepower Go-Devil that could barely push it past 65 miles per hour. Its chassis was flat, its body angular, its suspension stiff, but the beauty was in what it didn't have. No complex gearboxes, no delicate carburation systems, no components that required fine-tuning. It could be taken apart and reassembled in the field with a hammer and a wrench. If the radiator burst, soldiers patched it with tape. If the clutch burned out, a replacement could be bolted in minutes. German mechanics, accustomed to adjusting tolerances by hand, could scarcely believe it. To them, this wasn't engineering. It was industrial art. One report concluded, "This vehicle is designed to function even when abused. It is the opposite of our philosophy." That single observation explained more about the outcome of the war than any tactical analysis ever could. For the men who drove it, the Jeep was more than transportation. It was liberation. Infantrymen loved it for its reliability. Officers used it as a mobile command post. Medics turned it into field ambulances. It became a symbol of equality within the U.S. Army. Generals and privates rode in the same machine. In the desert, the Jeep gave soldiers freedom of movement. In Europe, it gave them speed. In the Pacific, it gave them adaptability, able to cross coral, jungle, and mud with the same indifference. Its open frame invited air, dust, and danger, but also closeness. Troops drove with wind in their faces, often with rifles across their laps and helmets hanging from the side. War correspondents later wrote that the Jeep was the face of the American soldier, dusty, scarred, unstoppable. For captured German soldiers who rode in them under guard, it was their first close contact with American culture. Casual, efficient, unpretentious. Many later said it was the first time they understood why America could fight a world war and not collapse under its weight. To American strategists, the Jeep was never about performance. It was about production. The war demanded a vehicle that could be built by the hundreds of thousands, repaired anywhere, and shared among every branch of service. The Jeep met all three requirements and became the foundation of a global supply chain. Factories that once made sedans or farm tools were converted overnight. Women on assembly lines in Ohio and Michigan learned to weld frames and bolt transmissions. Every part had a serial number and standard design, ensuring compatibility across oceans and continents. That standardization, the quiet, unseen efficiency, terrified the Germans more than any tank or bomber. A captured Wehrmacht intelligence report from 1943 noted, "The Americans do not produce weapons. They produce the means to make weapons, infinitely." This insight reshaped how German officers viewed the war. They realized they weren't fighting an army. They were fighting an economy, where the Jeep truly differed was in its personality. It embodied an attitude, improvisation, resilience, and optimism, traits that reflected the American psyche at war. While the German soldier moved within hierarchy and precision, the American soldier thrived on flexibility. The Jeep fit perfectly into that rhythm. Small, adaptable, always ready. Photographs from 1943 show GIs decorating Jeeps with pin-up art, nicknames, and unit markings. They weren't just machines, they were companions, part of the team. Crews gave them names like Blitz Buggy, Faithful Joe, and Hell on Wheels. In contrast, German troops viewed vehicles as instruments, extensions of command, not personality. That cultural gap was subtle but immense. Where the American army found pride in commonality, the German army found pride in perfection. And on the vast battlefields of the 1940s, perfection could not be sustained. When captured, Jeeps reached German workshops in Europe. They became study subjects for the Wehrmacht's engineers. Blueprints were drawn, components cataloged, performance tested. The verdict was unanimous. It was mechanically inferior in many respects, yet operationally superior in every way that mattered. Attempts were made to replicate it. The Germans experimented with hybrid prototypes, combining Jeep features with Kübelwagen designs. But their production system, constrained by limited resources and centralized control, couldn't replicate the Jeep's simplicity. It was a machine born from a free market culture, not one that could be ordered into existence. In one surviving field note, a frustrated German technician scribbled, "They build machines like they build sandwiches, fast, identical, endless." It was meant as criticism, but it read like prophecy. The more the Germans studied the Jeep, the more they realized it wasn't just a weapon. It was a window into the American way of war, where creativity and practicality beat tradition and theory. It was the quiet revolution of modern warfare, the shift from craftsmanship to mass production, from elegance to efficiency. And for the men who first turned a wrench on that captured Jeep in the desert, the revelation was both humbling and terrifying. Because in its humming engine and dusty steel, they saw not just a vehicle, but a glimpse of the future. As the war pressed into its final years, the Jeep's reputation had outgrown the battlefield. To every army that encountered it, friend or foe, it became a study in contradiction. Light but powerful, crude but reliable, small yet unstoppable. And beneath its modest frame lay a revolution that reshaped how the world would think about engineering, logistics, and power itself. The Jeep's design philosophy was a product of hard lessons. The U.S. Army had entered World War II with vehicles that looked impressive on paper but failed in the field. The Jeep was different. It was born from soldier feedback, not engineer ambition. Its boxy frame reduced manufacturing complexity. Its short wheelbase made it maneuverable. Its four-wheel drive gave it the grip of a mountain goat. Even its canvas, roof, and open doors were deliberate, easier to replace and repair than metal shells. German engineers admired its pragmatic use of materials. In an era of shortages, the Jeep used less of everything: fewer rivets, less fuel, thinner steel. It wasn't armored because it didn't need to be. Its best defense was speed and simplicity. In technical evaluations, German officers noted that the Jeep's parts could be repaired by anyone with two hands and common sense. It was, in many ways, the perfect soldier's machine. Not indestructible, but irrepressible. No other vehicle in history carried so many commanders to victory. From General Eisenhower in Europe to General Patton in North Africa, and Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific, the Jeep became the unofficial staff car of Allied command. Eisenhower later said, "The Jeep, the Dakota, and the landing craft were the three tools that won the war." It was a bold statement, but he wasn't exaggerating. The Jeep's ability to travel anywhere, from mountain passes to beachheads, gave Allied commanders mobility no other army possessed. For Patton, it was a symbol of aggression and speed. For Montgomery, it was a reliable link between frontline and headquarters. For MacArthur, it became part of his legend. He famously rode one ashore when reclaiming the Philippines. Meanwhile, on the German side, generals watched these scenes unfold with disbelief. Their own leaders traveled in heavy armored staff cars or modified trucks. The idea of a commander riding in an open vehicle, shoulder to shoulder with his men, was unthinkable. The Jeep represented a kind of leadership that was flexible, visible, and mobile, one that moved with the war rather than standing above it. Beyond its mechanics and tactics, the Jeep's greatest contribution was economic. It proved that wartime success depended not on how much a nation could design, but on how much it could build. The Willys and Ford factories that produced Jeeps were not symbols of luxury or innovation. They were monuments to process. Every minute new Jeeps rolled off the line. Every component had a number, every worker had a role. By war's end, 640,000 Jeeps had been produced, enough to give one to every 40 Allied soldiers. Germany, in comparison, could barely keep up with the replacement of its armored divisions. Captured German officers, interrogated after the war, often pointed to this imbalance. One colonel remarked, "You could destroy their machines, but you could not destroy their factories." The Jeep was the living proof of that truth, a product of a system that could lose thousands of vehicles without losing momentum. By 1944, as the tide of war turned against Germany, more and more Jeeps fell into German hands, not as prizes but as reminders of what was coming. In Normandy, during the Allied advance, German units captured abandoned Jeeps near Caen and Saint-Lô. Mechanics once again examined them, now with quiet resignation instead of curiosity. They knew the war was lost long before Berlin fell. They could see it in the steel before them, the simplicity, the reproducibility, the efficiency. A war that once celebrated the artisan was now ruled by the assembler. When one captured officer was asked what impressed him most about the Jeep, he didn't mention its performance or design. He simply said, "It always starts." That reliability, mundane to Americans, miraculous to their enemies, summed up the industrial soul of the United States. In a world crumbling under its own complexity, the Jeep's simplicity was salvation. After 1945, the lessons of the Jeep spread far beyond the war. Germany's post-war auto industry studied it extensively. Volkswagen engineers, many of whom had once examined captured Jeeps in Africa and Europe, adapted its principles of modularity and repairability into peacetime vehicles. The same philosophy guided post-war civilian Jeeps, the CJ series, and influenced decades of off-road design worldwide. The concept of a light, universal utility vehicle became standard military doctrine. In a sense, every modern military 4x4, from NATO transport trucks to peacekeeping Land Rovers, traces its ancestry to the Willys Jeep. But its greatest legacy wasn't mechanical. It was ideological. It showed that power didn't come from perfection, it came from practicality, and that the strongest nations weren't those who built the best machines, but those who built the most reliable ones, together. By the time the dust settled in 1945, the German army had learned a truth it could not unlearn. The war of craftsmanship had ended, and the age of production had begun. The Jeep was not the most powerful weapon of World War II, but it was the most symbolic. It represented everything the Axis underestimated and everything the Allies stood for. And to the German mechanics who once laughed at its shape and simplicity, it left one final lesson. America's greatest engineering triumph wasn't the Jeep itself. It was the mind that made something so ordinary, extraordinary. By early 1943, the balance in North Africa was shifting. The desert, once dominated by the swift movements of Rommel's Afrika Korps, had turned into a proving ground for Allied logistics, a contest not just of strategy, but of endurance. And at the center of that transformation was a small, unarmored, four-wheeled machine, the Jeep. The first major test came in February 1943, when German and American forces clashed at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. It was a baptism of fire for the young U.S. Army and for its new machines. The Americans suffered heavy losses at first. Rommel's veteran troops, supported by Panzers and Stukas, pushed through the American lines with terrifying efficiency. But even amid the chaos of retreat, the Jeeps kept moving. They carried ammunition under fire. They evacuated the wounded through shell-scarred passes. They scouted German movements when tanks couldn't pass. To the Germans chasing them, these small vehicles seemed almost reckless, darting through artillery barrages, bounding over rock and sand, their drivers unarmored but undeterred. When the Americans regrouped under General George S. Patton, the Jeep became the nervous system of the new offensive. At El Guitar, it was everywhere, carrying messages, towing anti-tank guns, ferrying officers. It was the first battle where the U.S. Army fought as a modern, mobile force, and the Jeep was its bloodstream. Captured German reports from the battle noted, the Americans use these light vehicles in numbers that defy reason. They are like insects, everywhere at once. What the Germans saw as excess was, in fact, America's greatest strength, production without limitation. When the war left North Africa for Europe, the Jeep came with it, now a veteran of the sands. In Italy, it climbed mountains where even mules faltered. In Normandy, it rolled off landing craft hours after D-Day, already loaded with supplies. In France, it carried medics through rubble and officers across rivers under sniper fire. Wherever American forces landed, the first sound often heard after the engines of landing craft was the low, steady growl of Jeep motors. In one remarkable scene recorded near Carentan in June 1944, a German sniper was captured after he mistakenly fired on a Jeep convoy he thought was unarmed. He later told his interrogators, "We used to laugh at them in Africa. Now they seem to multiply faster than our bullets." The laughter was gone. The respect, grudging but real, had taken its place. By late 1944, as the Western Front expanded, the Wehrmacht could no longer ignore the evidence. It wasn't just the Jeep, it was everything it represented. Standardization, mobility, ubiquity. For every German vehicle lost, it took weeks to replace. For every Jeep destroyed, 2 more arrived on the next convoy. German soldiers began to use captured Jeeps themselves whenever possible, calling them Beute Jeeps, booty Jeeps. They painted over the stars, swapped insignia, and used them for reconnaissance. Even SS units adopted them for field use, a silent acknowledgement of their superiority. One surviving Wehrmacht maintenance log from 1944 notes, "The enemy's small car performs tasks that would require 3 of ours. Its ease of service and lightness are exceptional." That quiet note, written in the margins of a fading notebook, marked the moment Germany understood it could not keep up. The war had moved into a new dimension, one of speed and logistics, not just courage and tactics, and the Jeep was the clearest symbol of that evolution. In the spring of 1944, as Allied forces advanced through Italy, the Jeep again proved indispensable. Narrow roads, shattered bridges, and constant shelling made movement nearly impossible for larger vehicles. But the Jeep, with its narrow frame and adaptable tires, could cross terrain that seemed impassable. German soldiers watched, often from retreating positions, as these small American machines ferried supplies to mountaintop units under fire. They were relentless, almost indifferent to hardship. An Italian civilian mechanic who witnessed them later said, "They were like ants. No matter how many were crushed, more came." To the Germans who once prided themselves on perfect engineering, the Jeep was a humbling revelation, the triumph of practical design over mechanical pride. For the American soldier, the Jeep became a companion. For the German soldier, it became a warning. Everywhere the Jeep appeared, it signaled an advancing front, a moving line of supply and confidence. It became an emblem of inevitability. The sound of its engine, once dismissed as background noise, now carried dread. When captured, Germans were interrogated after the fall of Rome. Many admitted that the presence of Jeeps behind the lines often meant one thing: the Americans were already there. One POW reportedly told his captors, "When we saw those little cars, we knew the line had broken. The Jeep had crossed a symbolic threshold. It was no longer just a machine. It was the physical embodiment of America's unstoppable advance, a weapon of momentum." And for the men who first mocked it in the sands of North Africa, the realization was bitter and complete. What they had once laughed at was now driving them from one defeat to the next. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had become a contest of endurance. The Allies advanced relentlessly from west and south, while the German army, bleeding from every front, tried to fight a war it could no longer sustain. Everywhere the American Jeep appeared, from frozen forest roads to shattered French villages, it symbolized not just an army in motion, but a nation that had mastered the art of movement itself. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the Jeep faced its hardest test yet. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Snow-clogged roads, engines froze solid overnight. German tanks advanced through the Ardennes forest, their treads grinding through the frost like iron beasts. To stop them, the Americans relied on mobility, the one advantage that remained even in chaos. Convoys of Jeeps carried ammunition, rations, and wounded men through snowbound paths that trucks couldn't reach. They moved without lights, guided by the faint reflection of snow on their hoods. At Bastogne, surrounded and cut off, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division depended entirely on these small vehicles for resupply runs under artillery fire. When the fog lifted and Allied aircraft returned to the skies, the Jeep once again surged ahead, racing through the white forest, ferrying medics, officers, and intelligence scouts. German prisoners captured during the battle recalled seeing endless lines of them crisscrossing the roads like insects. One SS officer told his interrogators, "Your Jeeps are like ghosts. You hear them before you see them, and when you do, you've already lost the road." It was no exaggeration. The Jeep had become the connective tissue of an army too large for any one general to control, yet so well organized that its smallest machines carried the weight of victory. By March 1945, when Allied forces reached the Rhine River, the war's outcome was already certain. The Jeep was now a fixture in every convoy, every column, every victory photograph. As engineers built pontoon bridges across the Rhine under German fire, Jeeps were the first to cross, carrying officers, signalmen, and scouts. They were the vanguard of liberation, rolling into towns still burning from retreating Wehrmacht units. German civilians, emerging from cellars and ruins, saw them as the face of America itself, young, confident, and unstoppable. For some, the sight was relief. For others, humiliation. The vehicle that had once puzzled the Afrika Korps now symbolized the industrial inevitability of defeat. A German mechanic in Cologne, forced to work on captured Jeeps during the occupation, later said, "It was like seeing the future, simple, loud, and everywhere." He didn't mean it as praise, but history would remember it as exactly that. By the war's final months, even the most hardened German engineers admitted what had become undeniable. In military debriefings and postwar memoirs, many confessed to having underestimated the Jeep's significance. Famed Luftwaffe commander Adolf Galland, though a pilot, once remarked that the Americans had turned mobility into a weapon. He wasn't speaking only of aircraft. He was referring to everything that kept those aircraft supplied. Fueled and moving, the Jeep, to men like Galland, represented an entirely different kind of warfare, one built on logistics, not legend. To the Germans who had grown up worshipping mechanical mastery, it was a humbling revelation. The future belonged to the nation that could produce efficiency, not elegance. When the Allies rolled into Germany proper in 1945, Jeeps led the way. They carried war correspondents, field photographers, and soldiers who had marched from the sands of Africa to the streets of Berlin. The roads were rubble, the bridges destroyed, but the Jeeps kept going. They crossed fields, tram lines, even the bombed-out remains of city squares. For the German population, now living amid the collapse of their once proud industrial state, the contrast was inescapable. The same nation that had once built masterpieces of engineering, the Tiger tank, the Messerschmitt, the V-2 rocket, had been defeated by a machine that anyone could fix with a wrench. The irony was almost poetic. One German engineer, writing in a technical journal in 1946, summarized the lesson in a single sentence: "In war, reliability is genius." That sentence would later become the motto of countless post-war industries rebuilding from the ruins of defeat. In the last days of the war, as American convoys rolled through German towns, a small group of captured Wehrmacht mechanics were ordered to assist U.S. troops in maintaining their vehicles. Among them were men who had first seen the Jeep years earlier in Africa. One of them, now gray, exhausted and silent, watched an American sergeant replace a Jeep carburetor in under 10 minutes. No manuals, no special tools, just instinct and experience. When asked by a translator what he thought, the mechanic sighed. "We could never build this," he said quietly. "We would never think to." It wasn't a confession of failure. It was an admission of philosophy. Germany had built for precision. America had built for endurance. And in the end, endurance had prevailed. As the guns fell silent and the war ended in May 1945, the Jeep remained unparked in ruined towns, roaring across victory parades and rumbling toward new frontiers. It had outlasted the Reich, outpaced the tanks, and outshone the myths. To the Germans who once mocked it, the Jeep became the most honest teacher of the war, and its lesson was simple. Strength isn't found in perfection. It's found in what keeps going when perfection breaks. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was unrecognizable. Cities were in ruins, borders erased, and millions displaced. But amid the devastation, one image stood out: columns of American Jeeps driving through the wreckage of the Reich. Their tires crunching over rubble, their white stars reflected in the shattered glass of a fallen empire. For the victors, the Jeep was a symbol of mobility and freedom. For the defeated, it was a revelation, a four-wheeled reminder of everything Germany had underestimated. In the aftermath of surrender, the Allies conducted exhaustive studies of German industry and military design. The goal was to understand how such a technologically advanced nation had still lost the war. One of the more surprising conclusions came not from tank analysis or aircraft evaluation, but from a comparative study of utility vehicles. The report concluded that the Jeep, not the tank or the bomber, had been the most effective machine of the Allied war effort, not because of power, but because of purpose. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't flawless, but it worked, everywhere all the time. When German engineers were invited to inspect captured Allied vehicles under Allied supervision, many were quietly impressed. They found the Jeep's engineering crude but brilliant, the culmination of lessons they themselves had ignored. A former Volkswagen engineer remarked during a post-war debriefing, "It was as if America had turned our precision upside down and made it better by making it simpler." In the late 1940s, as West Germany began rebuilding under the Marshall Plan, that lesson began to take root. Factories that had once built tanks and Kübelwagens were now retooled for civilian production. Among them was Volkswagen, whose surviving engineers had studied the Jeep during the war. The new Volkswagen Beetle, simple, reliable, inexpensive, bore the same DNA of practicality that the Jeep had demonstrated. For the first time, German design embraced mass production, standardized parts, and easy maintenance. This was no coincidence. The Jeep had shown the world that simplicity could scale, and that durability could outlast artistry. Germany, once obsessed with perfection, learned the value of efficiency. And in that transformation lay the foundations of its post-war economic miracle. For the Americans returning home, the Jeep was more than a vehicle. It was a memory on wheels. They had driven it through dust, snow, and blood, through Normandy fields and Italian hills. It had carried them to victory and sometimes away from death. When peacetime came, many veterans wanted to bring it home. Factories responded by producing civilian versions, the Willys CJ civilian Jeep. It became a symbol of freedom, resilience, and everyday adventure. Meanwhile, German prisoners of war who had worked on American bases or handled captured Jeeps during their captivity often spoke of it with a kind of grudging respect. They had seen firsthand how it embodied America's greatest weapon, its ability to turn the ordinary into the unstoppable. One POW, later an auto mechanic in Stuttgart, told a journalist in 1952, We lost to the people who built that car. It never broke, and neither did they. The Jeep didn't just win battles, it changed minds. It showed that progress wasn't about creating flawless machines, but about empowering flawed people to use them easily and effectively. That philosophy echoed far beyond military design. It influenced post-war manufacturing, education, even management theory. The idea that function outweighs perfection became a cornerstone of modern industry, from Detroit to Wolfsburg to Tokyo. And behind it all was the lesson the Germans had learned the hard way. Simplicity, multiplied by millions, can defeat complexity every time. By the late 1940s, the Jeep had become more than a wartime relic. It was an icon of modernity, of a new kind of world, one built on practicality, mobility, and shared purpose. But for those who once mocked it in the desert, it would always remain something else, a symbol of the moment they realized that brilliance without scalability was just a dead end in disguise. By 1946, the Jeep had become a paradox, both a tool of conquest and a vehicle of reconstruction. In the war's aftermath, it rolled not toward battle but toward rebuilding. Allied engineers used it to transport supplies across bombed-out cities, deliver mail to displaced families, and tow debris from ruined streets. In the ashes of war, the same machine that had symbolized invasion now carried food, hope, and renewal. In the United States, returning soldiers brought home their affection for the Jeep. For them, it wasn't just a machine. It was a companion that had survived everything. Civilian production began almost immediately. The Willys CJ series, civilian Jeep, transformed the vehicle from military legend to national icon. Farmers used it to plow fields, ranchers to herd cattle, and families to explore roads where roads didn't exist. The Jeep became part of America's identity, rugged, independent, unpretentious. It stood for a new kind of heroism, the ordinary citizen who could do extraordinary things with simple tools. Its marketing slogan, "The sun never sets on the Willys Jeep," was more than clever advertising. It was truth. From Europe to Asia, Africa to South America, Jeeps were still running, still serving, long after the war's victors and vanquished had laid down their arms. In post-war Germany, the Jeep lingered in memory like a lesson written in metal. It had exposed not only the flaws of Nazi strategy, but also the limitations of a national mindset, the belief that sophistication guaranteed superiority. For decades, German engineers would reference the Jeep in design discussions, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly, as the example of functional genius. Its spirit reappeared in vehicles like the Volkswagen Type 181 Kübelwagen, 1969, and even influenced the philosophy behind Mercedes-Benz's Geländewagen, G-Class, introduced decades later. Each was a tribute, however indirect, to the humble machine that had shown the world that perfection was overrated. In university lectures, post-war professors of mechanical engineering often contrasted the Jeep and the Tiger tank, two icons of opposing philosophies. One was fearsome, flawless, and fragile. The other was simple, accessible, and enduring. History had chosen its favorite. By the 1950s, the Jeep was everywhere, not as a conqueror but as a companion. It served in the armies of dozens of nations, from NATO to developing countries rebuilding their economies. In humanitarian missions, it carried medicine instead of ammunition. In civil life, it became a bridge between soldier and citizen. It was in many ways the embodiment of post-war ideals: adaptability, freedom, and endurance. Wherever it went, it carried the quiet authority of something that had already been tested by history and found unbreakable. For Germans who had once studied captured Jeeps in dusty North African garages, the sight of those same vehicles now hauling timber, mail, or children in the countryside was humbling. The enemy's machine had become the world's workhorse. Time softened the pride and bitterness that had once divided victors and vanquished. German engineers who had once mocked the Jeep later admitted their admiration for it. In technical memoirs written in the 1960s, one recalled, "It was not the weapon that beat us, but the thinking behind it." The Jeep's triumph wasn't mechanical, it was moral. It proved that strength didn't come from domination, but from cooperation. Its design showed that victory belonged to the system that empowered the many, not glorified the few. That realization echoed through post-war Europe. A continent rebuilding not around perfection, but around function, reliability, and shared purpose. By the time the last wartime Jeep was retired from active service, its legacy had already spread into every corner of modern life. It inspired generations of engineers, symbolized American ingenuity, and quietly rewrote the rules of design itself. And though its shape would evolve, its message remained timeless. War teaches many lessons, but few as enduring as this, that the simplest ideas, multiplied with discipline and purpose, can change the world. The Jeep began as a sketch, a desperate idea drawn on paper in 1940 when the world was preparing for chaos. By war's end, it had become more than a machine. It was an idea made real, the belief that strength lies not in complexity but in clarity. To the Germans who first laughed at its shape, it seemed a toy unworthy of an army. To the Americans who built and drove it, it was a promise. That simplicity, multiplied by will and purpose, could outlast any empire built on arrogance. Every battlefield it crossed, from the dunes of North Africa to the forests of the Ardennes, told the same story: resilience over refinement, function over form. When precision met production, production won. When genius met endurance, endurance survived. The Jeep was never beautiful, but it was honest. It didn't hide its purpose behind polish or pride. It carried the wounded, the weary, and the victorious with equal indifference. A machine without ego, designed only to serve. And that was its greatest triumph. In its rattle and dust, in the hum of its little four-cylinder engine, the world heard something new, the sound of industrial democracy. A reminder that greatness doesn't need perfection. It needs people working together, building something that lasts. For the German mechanics who once circled that captured Jeep in the desert, that truth came slowly, painfully, undeniably. They had seen a glimpse of the future, and it was built not by brilliance alone, but by unity, simplicity, and relentless repetition. Decades later, as the last wartime Jeep sat silent in museums and barns, their legacy remained alive in every car, truck, and tool built with the same spirit. It was the whisper of a lesson written in steel. Real power isn't what you build, it's what keeps moving after everything else has stopped.